Hi everybody, it's Nikki and I'm here to do another video that is my personal experience, not to be used as medical advice, personal thought, personal experience, personal whatever. There is no medical advice. I am doing a video, I'm actually going to do a series of videos, very boring videos, and nobody will watch maybe, and that would be okay. I'm purging everything before I go over to the T-Slim and Dexcom. I've been on the 670 for over a year. I have really not been on it for about the last 3 months or so because I've been wearing the Omnipod, I've been doing MDI, and my next stop is T-Slim and Dexcom. And I've been on Medtronic for 12 years. They've been good to me for 12 years. This last year has not been the best year. However, I really do like them for what they've done for me as a diabetic. At this point, however, it's time for me to find something new. And my number one problem has to do with their sensors, and that has always been true, so that's nothing new. However, even though it is my number one problem, Medtronic continues to be the only company that provides a visible iSig, and that is a huge deal to me because I do use the calibration factor for reasons other than just determining whether or not calibration is good. And it's that fact right there that's making me feel so sad and lonely about leaving the Guardian, sometime over the next couple of weeks once this whole thing gets processed. So I figured in the last year, I've done an enormous amount of work on my sensors, on collecting data, on collecting iSigs, SGs, sensor glucose values, BGs, and then calculating my calibration factors, sometimes as many as 20 or 30 a day. So I have a long history of a lot of numbers where I can see the overall downward trend of how these sensors are performing. So I figured before I go over to T-Slim, which I would like to do with a clear conscience and a clear mind, and I'd like to, focus all my energy there once I get there. I figured I would do this first and I would attempt to put together something for Medtronic. I don't think they're ever going to watch, but just kind of showing them where I think the sensors started to go bad, how I know they're going bad, and why so many people are having problems with auto mode. So I am putting together something for the Facebook group. Unfortunately, I don't know if they're reading it or not, but I'm putting it in front of them, and I'm doing it as a way to organize my thoughts for this. And then I'm going to call Medtronic, and I'm going to, see who I can get to with this. And see if we can have a discussion about it. I don't have any idea. But what I will do is I will read and add and to what I've done. I've already done this work, so I'll go ahead and read it, and I'll just kind of contribute where I see fit. But and this will be done over a number of videos with very bad graphics and everything else, because that's how I do. Okay, so Kate Feist and Natalie Reeder. You guys recently were talking about, these are two people from my Facebook group, and you guys were recently talking about some troubles with your sensors and kind of feeling crazy, because that's the 670G way. That feeling crazy, is this me? Am I nuts? Is it my, is it my device? And you guys motivated me to put this together. And it's because I don't think you're crazy, unless it's just the three of us that are, and there's that possibility, but I don't think so. I think that there are a lot of people out there, a lot of people who are jumping ship, and even more people who are just talking about these big problems where they're getting many sensors from one box that don't work, and people saying things like, "I can't get into auto mode. I haven't been able to get into auto mode for a month." I think I understand why, and so that's what I'm doing. And thank you guys for motivating me to get it together. Okay, so I have all of these logs. I started keeping them about a year ago. I was keeping them in the beginning to try to keep track of my blood sugar. Then it became a way to keep track of what auto was doing, because I needed to do that. And then it became a way to keep track of what my sensor was doing. As I was collecting all these numbers, this started about a year and a half ago, somewhere in there, where a Medtronic representative told me, "Nikki, if you need to know if calibrating is a good time, if it's a good time to calibrate, go ahead and calculate this calibration factor, BG divided by iSig." So I did it, and he said, if you do that, you'll always know whether or not it's a good time. So I took that advice very, very seriously and began to calculate it at every calibration. And in that, I started to see some really interesting patterns. And it was enough, coupled with many pots of coffee, to start to learn that information was more valuable than just whether or not it was a good time to calibrate. It actually gave me an idea. You're going to think I'm crazy, but it actually gave me an idea whether or not my BG, my current BG, was a thick or thin BG. I can't cram all this into one video. Basically, if I had a BG of a 100, whether or not that was a thinning 100, if I was maybe, in the potential to fall, or if it was a thick 100, like maybe I was on the rise and I needed insulin or I needed to get up. So I began to track all of it, and then from those logs and from those patterns, I had to kind of make my own rules for what they meant. The only thing I do not know, and I have no way of knowing, is this only true for me? Is this range, is this whatever, is it only true for me? My gut is it's not. My gut is that this is probably kind of what we all do, and that is based on the fact that right as I began to see a bigger and bigger inflation of calibration factors that was not truly representative of what was happening with my blood sugar, I also started to hear more and more people having problems with their sensors, to the point that just last week, and this is part of a video I want to do as well, just last week, the first 3 days on my sensor, over 50% of my calibrations would not have been taken in auto mode, and 36% of them wouldn't have been taken in manual mode. That's a big problem, and that is very much in line with what people are saying currently with their own sensors. And the reason I can see that is because I am calculating my calibration factor, and so I can see that everything is in the 8s, whereas a year ago everything was in the 4s and 5s, so there was no problem. Okay, I'm doing more adding than I thought I was going to do. Okay, so with all those numbers, that's my justification for my general statements about these sensors being bad, or they're being faulty, or them being weak. And I even kind of wonder whether or not this could boil down to an issue with coding. That's the non-scientist in me trying to overdo things. Okay, so I'll leave that alone. All right. The only thing I can't say, I just said that I'm overwhelmed by my numbers. So I'm trying to find a way to organize and present, and this is all going to be imperfect. I'm 7 minutes in. I'm going to try to cover what assumptions I've created or I've come to on how the calibration factor works. And then I'm going to show some ranges of when I had what I call healthy sensors versus when I had sensors that were beginning to show inflated calibration factors, and then like a sensor that was a faulty one. And then to see this progression, how those factors continue to rise and rise, again, right up until last week, where 50% of what I was doing would not have been accepted in auto mode and 36% not even in manual. Okay. All right. So the first sensor I wanted to discuss is a February sensor, and this was a healthy sensor. This was before I started to see any problems. However, before I tell you about my healthy sensor in February, I figure I'll give you a few of my calibration factor assumptions. Okay. These are the rules as I have gathered them. Okay. Number one, the range I found to be most common when my sensors were performing well, and that is what I'm going to call my healthy sensors, was about 3.5 to 6.5, a calibration factor of about 3.5 to 6.5. I want to say that 88% or something of my numbers fell within that range. Below 3.5 happened. In fact, I could see it as low as a 2.4 or something like that, 2.2 maybe. But that was a drastic low and falling blood sugar. And above 6.5 absolutely could happen, but it took a certain combination of conditions. And in general, it was either a very fast climbing blood sugar from a rebound, which could happen, or it was an already high blood sugar that was rising and rising fast. So it's not that those didn't happen, it's that the majority of what I saw was between 3.5 and 6.5. For those of you guys that don't know, in general, I think the Medtronic range is 3 to 8, say 3-ish to 8-ish, and that's where our calibrations can occur. So if mine was 3.5 to 6.5, that meant almost everything was within that range already. So there were no problems with calibrating. Okay, that's number one. Number two, a very low blood sugar most often yields a lower calibration factor. So generally speaking, lower end BGs should mean lower factors. The exception is when I have a lower BG that is on the rebound, which can result in a higher factor. So here's my examples. A low and falling or stable combination might mean a BG of 75 with a calibration factor of, say, 3.7. It's a low and falling blood sugar. Whereas a low but rebounding combination might look like a BG of 75 with a calibration factor of a 6.1. So that's what I refer to as thick and thin. My 3.7 is thin. If I get up and try to walk across the street, I'm probably gonna crash. Whereas my 6.1, my 75 6.1 is a thick 75, and that walk across the street might stop me from going too high. Okay. Number 3, a very high blood sugar on the flip side often yields a calibration factor on the higher end of the range. A high BG that is rising often yields a calibration factor outside of my normal range. So it's why a high and rising BG is the worst time to calibrate, because there's a very good chance you're going to get pushed up above that 8. Examples, a high BG that has stabled out might be a BG of 240 with a calibration factor of, say, a 5.9 or a 5.4 or even a 6. Whereas a BG that is continuing to rise might look like a BG of 240 with a calibration factor of 7.7. So that one is still going, needs more treatment. A very low ISIG can be a sign, this is number 4, very low ISIG can be a sign of a very low blood sugar or a faulty sensor. The ISIG value without the BG context is not useful. So for people who are saying, well, my ISIG is a 13, is it okay? That 13 means nothing without your current BG. So a very low ISIG, sometimes you can see an ISIG of an 8.8. That could mean that your blood sugar is low, and at that point it would be okay. If you have an 8.8 with a blood sugar of a 60, it's okay. However, if you have an 8.8 with a blood sugar of a 200, it's probably a sign of a faulty sensor. So that low ISIG can mean a low blood sugar, or it can mean a faulty sensor. It depends on, you need the context. Number 5, and I'm running out of time. Number 5, for me, it was common to see a slow but steady inflation of calibration factors anytime after day 5 of my sensor. As those factors rose, they were no longer reliable for my purposes. However, the interesting thing is that the inflation of factors rarely seemed to affect the accuracy of the sensor, or at least not significantly so. Over time, I began to come to expect to see that inflation in calibration factor range, and it seemed it was a sign of the degradation of the sensor. Towards the end of the sensor's life, I would often get sensors that were outside of my range that were not a result of my blood sugar or change in blood sugar as described earlier. They were just inflated, and they were a sign of degradation. So at some point around day 5 or 6, I started to realize I could no longer use that for treatment because those numbers weren't real, they were inflated. And I think that may have been in that coding, and that's when the coding starts to degrade, and that is that inflated calibration factor, again, the non-scientist in me. Okay, number 6, the last couple of days with this inflated range would prove to be more difficult and would usually be the time I would see things like sensor updating, if I were to see it at all. Other difficulties, such as with calibrating, would often occur during this time. So this is back when I had healthy sensors. That's why days 5, 6, and 7 could prove problematic because of that inflated calibration factor. It made calibrating a little bit trickier. It could mean going into auto mode could be trickier. So if all of a sudden my calibration factor range goes from 3.5 to 6.5 and now I'm at 5 to 7, that means with a high and rising blood sugar, I'm now at 8.2. If I try to calibrate, it's a no-go. But those things began to be expected days 5 through 7, and they were a sign of sensor degradation. That is my quick summary of the calibration factor assumptions as far as I've gotten so far. And the reason I mention these things is because my calibration factors now are higher than what they used to be on days 5 through 7, meaning I'm starting at higher ranges, meaning that lots of my calibrations are not going to work. So that's video 1. Stay tuned. Thanks. Bye.